Good evening, everyone. I am Shirley Ann Gorshaw, the director of the Eisenhower Institute's Fielding Center for Presidential Leadership Study, which is hosting this event. Thank you for joining us tonight. We want to welcome you to tonight's discussion on the burgeoning business of space commerce, the extensive commercialization of space, from GPS satellites to mapping the moon for minerals, to satellites that repair commercial satellites, to private trips and order. These are the next steps in man's exploration of space. We have three experts tonight in the field and are delighted that they could be part of this panel. To handle both the introductions and to handle the questions are the fielding fellows. And with that, I'm going to hand the program over to our first fielding fellow, Matthew Feldstone. Matt?
Thank you very much, Dr. Warshaw, and thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for making the time to speak with us tonight. My name is Matthew Feldstein, one of the fielding fellows, and without further ado, I'll begin by introducing Mr. O'Connell. Mr. O'Connell brings over 35 years of experience in the United States government, in research organizations, and as an entrepreneur and business leader to this field. Most recently, as director of Space Commerce in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Previously, Mr. O'Connell served as the CEO of Innovative Analytics and Training, focusing on analysis and decision support for the United States government and commercial clients. He also served as a senior consultant to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and as an independent advisor to the Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Mr. O'Connell's background also includes extensive experience in national security and intelligence matters, including assignments in the Department of Defense, Department of State, the National Security Council, and the Office of the Vice President. He has spent a decade conducting and managing research in these areas at the RAND Corporation, including as the first director of RAND's Intelligence Policy Center. Finally, Mr. O'Connell has taught a long-running course on comparative intelligence at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, most notably the Security Studies program. Next, I'll be introducing Dr. Ryan Guglietta. Dr. Guglietta is a foreign affairs officer in the U.S. Department of State in the Office of Space Affairs. He received his Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of California, Los Angeles, before joining the State Department. The Office of Space Affairs carries out diplomatic and public diplomacy efforts to strengthen American leadership in space exploration and commercialization by increasing understanding of and support for U.S. national space policies and to encourage the foreign use of U.S. space capabilities, systems, and services. Dr. Guglietta primarily focuses on exploration and commercialization of space and global navigation, satellite systems, among other areas. At this point, I will pass it off to one of the other fielding fellows, Samantha, to continue introductions. Sam?
Thank you, Matthew. My name is Samantha Anastasiou, another one of the fielding fellows, and I will be introducing Keith Masback. Mr. Masback is an internationally recognized authority on geospatial intelligence with over 30 years of experience. Today, he provides strategic advice and counsel to a diverse portfolio of leading-edge startups focused on product market fit, go-to-market planning, and execution coaching. He was recently appointed to the Mapping Sciences Committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Previously, he served as an Army officer, a government senior executive, a member of the Intelligence Task Force on Defense Science Board, a member of the Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing, and as the chairman of the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. Prior to his role as CEO of PlumRun, a geospatial consulting firm, Mr. Masback served in the GeoSpatial Intelligence Agency and later as CEO of the GeoSpatial Intelligence Foundation. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us tonight. It is at this time that I would like to pass it off to Mr. O'Connell for his opening remarks, followed by Dr. Guglietta and Mr. Masback.
All right, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Matt and Samantha, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Shirley Ann and the Fielding Center for inviting us back. It's been a couple of years since we've been up to Gettysburg, and I know we all wish we'd be there tonight together. I'm honored to be on this panel with my colleagues, Ryan and Keith as well. So as mentioned, I was the former director of the Office of Space Commerce up until the end of the administration. And it was a very unique time given the reestablishment of the National Space Council. Again, for those that are interested in presidential leadership, interesting time given the reestablishment of the National Space Council, given the extent to which the government worked as a whole of government entity in the space area, given a very dynamic set of entrepreneurial activities across the country and really around the world, and other dimensions. And so it was a very unique time to look at that. You've seen that this past week, the Biden administration has actually agreed to sustain the National Space Council. And so the extent to which this idea continues on is actually, very, very important. Tonight, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my time in that role, and then really come at about 5 different points that I would make very quickly to stimulate some thinking. In the job that I had at Commerce for those 2.5 years, we literally met with hundreds of companies from around the country. My job was, as by law, the executive branch advocate on behalf of the U.S. commercial space industry. And so we met with companies big and small, everything from the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings down to, as I like to affectionately say, 5 people who seem to have been in a garage for the last 6 months without much food. And so we really enjoyed seeing entrepreneurs at all levels. I actually didn't like the labels old space and new space because we really did see innovation coming from across the entirety of the space industry. And by no means were we naive about it. It was not the case that all will succeed, but it was our job to try to help point those entrepreneurs to either government programs that were emerging that might take advantage of them, to help knock down regulatory barriers, and a handful of other things, really to improve the data on the space economy. So let me just hit 5 quick points about space commerce and really the broader business of space as the discussion, is going to continue tonight. The first one might surprise you, but I think it sets the context for our entire discussion. And the first point is, you probably don't know how much you've actually used space today. Now, maybe you've thought about it if you've checked the weather, or maybe you thought about it if you use the GPS app the mapping app on your cell phone, but you probably didn't either. By the way, the weather is getting much more precise, much more temporal, much great improvements in the weather area. But you probably didn't think about it if you used an ATM machine, or stopped at a traffic light, or conducted a financial transaction with a bank or a broker or something like that. You don't think about these things and how much they're really relying on space. At this moment, this call is probably somehow leveraging space capabilities to get from me to all of you. And so that's today. Okay, and we often don't think about that. It's what we all call the paradox of space in many ways. How much we rely on it, but how little we actually understand that. And often in Washington or around the country, you'll see these day without space exercises. That's today. Tomorrow, you're going to ride in an autonomous vehicle. I'm doing a lot of work right now on autonomous vehicles. You're going to ride in an autonomous vehicle that leverages space. You're going to be able to have food that's been grown in space. You may actually have to have an organ that is grown in the microgravity climate of space, or other things like that. If you're very lucky, you might get to take one of those early space tourism rides to space, but you have to have a lot of money to do that. And I hope other people are able to do that. But that's the context for this discussion. We really don't think explicitly about how much we use space. And next, let me jump to a separate point, which is what's going on in the global space economy. It's roughly a $400 billion economy globally, and that's everything from the work that NASA does to commercial entities around the world, et cetera. And so we often talk about the path to the $1 trillion space economy. Now, what's really going on there? You're seeing a lot of commercial activity that is coming from the application of business practices and efficiencies to traditional space acquisition models. And while the numbers are soft, and I'm happy to come back to this if it's helpful, it's hard to count. And there's a fairly healthy debate going on right now about what to count and how to count it. But by some estimates, the impact, the economic impact of space exceeds $5 trillion a year alone for the United States. And so when you think about it that way, it's different on the output side than the things that go into that. And again, that's where some of the commercial efficiencies are taking place. Tremendous international explosion, if you will, in interest in space. And I would argue that that interest internationally is as much driven by a desire to benefit economically from space as it is everyone being excited about Mars landings and things like that. So the exploration piece excites us all, but many, many, many countries are interested in space because of the economic benefits, economic growth, the establishment of a high-tech workforce, innovation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, let's go under the hood a little bit. My third point is what's really happening, okay? Commercial practices are being applied to traditional government acquisition models for space. And the place we see this the easiest is in the reusability that Elon Musk introduced, and more recently Rocket Labs in New Zealand, where we're looking at how to make use of things that are very costly. Meanwhile, advances, Keith has written about some of this in the past, advances in everything from materials to lightweight antennas, lower power antennas, are actually making things smaller and therefore less costly to put in space. We're also starting to take advantage of the crush of data that's coming down from space by using capabilities in communications and artificial intelligence, other things like that. Separately, there's a whole new wave of private insurance and financial instruments that are being applied. In the last decade, over $175 billion have been given in private equity or private capital to the space industry. But the most interesting part of that is roughly a fifth of it was given in 2020. And so we're seeing acceleration in the private finance and insurance aspects of this, which really helps shift risks from entrepreneurs to a broader community of people. Similarly, in the old days, for those that remember space in the old days, people who were in the finance business would throw money at space because it was interesting, it was exciting. They didn't really understand what made for a successful space business. Today, we are much more savvy about what makes for a successful space business, even as space businesses diversify. And what I would like to do is maybe cluster the kinds of entrepreneurs we're seeing in three different areas. The first are people that are trying to commercialize or do commercial capabilities for the things that have already been commercialized: remote sensing, weather, navigation, even launch. And so those are people I'll call the disruptors. Then there are people who are the innovators, the people who are going to go to the moon, the people who are going to do different things on the moon. Okay, they're inventing wholly new capabilities. And then lastly, a more interesting group of people that we've seen recently is the group of folks that are interested in building infrastructure, everything from the training, feeding, housing, equipping of people that are going to live in space for extended periods of time or on the moon. And, you know, or even beyond that, actually. And so that those are three general communities of activities that we're seeing there. One of the things we have to talk about is what the ingredients are to get us to the trillion-dollar space economies we used to like to talk about it at Commerce. And we actually have a sense of that at this point. Number one, we're going to need continuing entrepreneurship that is as dynamic as it has been. And again, every day we would see new kinds of entrepreneurship across a wide range of space sectors. Second, we need a continuing vibrant ecosystem of support, finance and insurance. And again, on a daily basis, that continues to grow and diversify in ways that were not imaginable even 10 years ago. Third, we need to think about effective regulation because this is a case where literally around the world, there are mature space countries which are trying to deregulate from an era in which the technology was a much slower moving thing. In addition, there are new countries coming into the space world which are trying to create effective regulation. How do you encourage regulation? How do you encourage entrepreneurship, I should say, while also protecting for safety and security? It's a very fine balance that has to be done. Third is talent. I cannot impress upon you how important the talent issue is for the space economy. And it's not just the sciences and engineering talent. We're going to need a whole range of talent for the space economy that ranges from artists and chefs to business applications developers to lawyers and economists and a whole range of others. Sometimes we get stuck on thinking we only need the hardcore scientific talent. We do need that, but we need a wide range of other folks as well. And so those ingredients are very, very important. as we go forward. The last point I'll make, and I know Ryan will probably speak to this as well, is we have to be mindful of taking care of what we're doing in space. The whole question of space safety and sustainability. Okay, when we are riding in our car down the road and we come upon another car in the United States, we know that I turn to the right and you turn to the right and we avoid one another. And that's a simple rule. It doesn't matter. I don't have to know the person in the other car. Those and 1,000 other kinds of rules that we have on Earth are ones that we don't have in space. And as space gets more and more crowded, we have a couple of problems on our hands. One is we have a space debris problem, where there are literally millions of pieces of debris that range from 10 centimeters or 2 centimeters to large rocket bodies that create risk to the International Space Station, to the billions of dollars of investment that's already been made in space, but also to the growth of space commerce as we're discussing it today. And so there's a technical aspect, and the central problem with the technical aspect is we still have a very poor understanding of the space environment, the way things move, et cetera. The other part of it, and again, I think it's probably a good segue to Ryan, is we need rules of the road that are established for how you behave in space. Today, if I'm warned that I'm at risk of a collision in space, that's known as a conjunction, okay, I can pretty much move any way I want to. Given the very rapid growth of new space objects, we're going to increase this year alone, we're going to go from roughly 2,000 space objects to adding another 50%. And that number is bound to grow and accelerate over the next few years with the mega constellations, new mission sets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to need rules of the road. We're going to need the international community to collaborate on ways that we reconcile things when there are potential collisions or orbits or things like that. And so we have to pay attention to that safety and sustainability piece, lest all the other things I've spoken about previously are either harmed or in many ways damaged beyond relief. And so on that note, maybe I'll stop and turn it over to Ryan. And thanks very much for having me tonight.
So I'd like to first start by saying and thanking Dr. Warshaw and the Fielding Fellows. I've been managing the Diplomacy Lab portfolio in my office this year. And, a lot of the times these things can kind of go in such a way where, getting a lively conversation going and trying to get people engaged in a topic can be difficult, but that has absolutely not been the case whatsoever with the Fielding Fellows. I mean, their level of curiosity and interest and insight into everything has really made every conversation I've had with them a joy. So, I've greatly appreciated this program and look forward to continuing it further. So I just have a couple slides and I'm going to try to share my screen. And, Kevin mentioned setting me up, and he did. He set me up very nicely because I am going to talk and build off of a couple of the things that he just said. All right, great. So one of the things that I work on in particular is kind of encompassed by Space Policy Directive 3, which was a space policy directive released by the previous administration in 2018 that focused on something called space traffic management. And that, as Kevin said, is a lot of, tracking what's up there, knowing what's up there, knowing what's going up, kind of establishing these rules of the road to make sure that you have a safe and sustainable space environment. So something I wanted to talk about today was kind of the economics of a specific piece of that. And that's something that I work on a lot, which is called space object registration. We're going to get into that in a second. So just very briefly, this is just a chart from 2018 showing, countries with the most active satellites in the world. Unsurprisingly, you can see that the US is there at the top, as well as China and Russia. And then, you get less as you go down. And it's really this category that's marked other that I kind of want to talk about a bit more. And to something Kevin also pointed to was kind of the diverse array of space actors you have now compared to what you had in the past. In the 50s, well, in the 60s and 70s, you really only had a couple nations that really could access space. And that has changed dramatically over the past several decades and will only continue to grow. I mean, that's what you can see here in this chart, just cumulative space launches by country. You can see I've just kind of highlighted between 57 and 74. You can see quite a few from the US, quite a few from the former Soviet Union. And then in the other category, it's hardly any. But now you can see that can be a substantial increase as time has gone on, and that's only going to get larger and larger. So the last thing I'm going to say about this is just a chart kind of showing world government expenditures on space programs, again in 2018. You can see US, Russia, China, all the ones you would expect have very large circles here, but it's really not the size of the circles, but just the number of the circles that you can see. Australia set up their space program last year. Azerbaijan is hosting the International Astronautical Congress, or was going to in 2021. Costa Rica has new commercial radar arrays. Israel and India both attempted moon landings over the past 2 years, which unfortunately were not successful. But point being is that you now have so many different actors in space, both governments and private sector actors. It's not just governments anymore. And this creates a really interesting set of opportunities, but also a set of challenges, because as Kevin mentioned, if you get this very congested space environment, you're going to run into a lot of problems. So I next want to talk a little bit about kind of the international legal framework that surrounds that. And it's really hard to make a slide called International Treaties look exciting, especially when it's just screenshots of text, but hopefully the shadowed background makes it a little bit better. So, we won't get into this in any great detail, but there are treaties that do set out kind of a legal framework for outer space operations. You have the Outer Space Treaty, which is this foundational treaty that, aside from talking about not appropriating other celestial bodies and not putting weapons of mass destruction in space, it also puts forth this idea of registering space objects. So when a country sends an object up into space, it says, hey, that object's mine. I'm going to register that object so people know that. And then that concept is built off of further by 2 other treaties. There's the Registration Convention and the Liability Convention, which both just kind of put in place how exactly that process is going to work. And then also, if something does happen, how does the liability of that issue go? Like if one satellite hits another satellite in space, how are you going to arbitrate that issue? Or if a satellite crash lands on another territory, what are you going to do about that? So there is this international framework in place. And space object registration is a thing. We've been doing it ever since that treaty came about. And, this is just an example of a very recent filing that we've submitted to the UN. So essentially, my office, in concert with really a lot of other areas of the federal government, will take in all of the launch data from all the US objects that are launched into space. The FAA will give us a report. The Department of Defense will give us a report because they also track that. And then we'll kind of comb through that, and we'll try to establish what's known as jurisdiction and control. Who is really responsible for that object in space? And then we have to make that determination, and then we file that with the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, which keeps a registry of all space objects that every country is party to this treaty provides. And it creates this central repository of really accountability for objects that are going up. And it's a great way of, getting these very useful statistics about who's sending what's up, who is, saying that they will have authorization and ongoing supervision of these objects. And it's just a very useful international system that really kind of builds into this network of making sure that we know what is in space. And because, this is just a very generic picture showing that it's important to know what's up there, especially as things grow and as you have more countries involved and things get far more confusing about whose object is what. Back in the 60s, it was going to be the US or it was going to be, the former Soviet Union was going to be who is owning that object. And now with all of the private corporations and you have all of these different governments, it becomes much more difficult to do that. So with, the whole idea of space object registration, first and foremost, it helps create a safe and sustainable space environment by really trying to make sure that governments are active and keeping track of what they send up into space. And, that is also something that the Outer Space Treaty talks about, is that, governments are responsible for the activities of, their national space activities, whether that is a government organization or a private corporation. So, there is this added impetus of a government really needing to be responsible for that. Also, by registering these objects, you provide transparency regarding what's going up and who is responsible for them. It encourages international collaboration between governments and even with private sector objects. We, as Kevin mentioned, Rocket Lab, which is a US company that launches out of New Zealand, and we talk to New Zealand very frequently about Rocket Lab launches, specifically about the issue of registration. And it really fosters this very collaborative effort between our government and the New Zealand government to try to work these issues out and try to have a proactive plan about it. And it really does foster better relations and specifically the space sector here. It also, raises awareness of congestion and debris, and it can also help determine supervisory roles and liability. Now, it's not the whole picture. Just because you register an object doesn't that mean you are solely liable for it. But all of these things really factor into this environment of creating a responsible space situation where people in governments really kind of have a handle on that. There's definitely room for improvement. This process is not perfect, and we're really trying to make a concerted effort, specifically through SPD 3, Space Policy Directive 3, to improve our timeliness and our accuracy of our filing. So I just kind of wanted to put that spin on it, kind of this registration responsible behaviors aspect to it. And that's all I really have to say for now. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Shirley Ann. Thanks to the Fielding Center. Thanks to Fred Fielding, an absolutely legendary Gettysburg alum. I am an alum of Gettysburg, graduating in 1987. I've got a son who graduated in 2019. I'm a big supporter and fan of the Eisenhower Institute, generally in the Fielding Center specifically. So this is, it's a wonderful opportunity this evening. Really appreciate the interaction with Matt and Samantha. And of course, it's fun to bat cleanup for Kevin and Ryan, two people who are truly among our nation's experts with respect to space. And while the sort of the space geeks were small for some time, it's proliferating now. And now as space expands, as Kevin mentioned, as Ryan suggested, in terms of having rules of the road or rules of space, critically important. And it's great to have people who have been toiling away at this for a long time to help lead the nation as we move forward. What I'd like to talk to you about is thinking about how we grasp this idea of what's going on in space. As in anything, certainly those of you who've chosen to be at a liberal arts institution, the ability to bin and analyze and synthesize and think about things. There's always more than one way, at least in the political science department. There was. I know it's a little harder for math, engineering, science majors and things, which is why I tried to stay away from that, because it's more difficult to argue your point. But I'm going to offer a way to think about space this evening for the next few minutes that may be helpful and understand how to bin things a little bit. First is to think about launch. How do we get to space? And of course, that starts with things like space ports. We're used to thinking about maritime ports, and we're used to thinking about airports. But in fact, now is the time that we will continue to see the development of spaceports. There's a spaceport in New Mexico. Ryan mentioned a spaceport in New Zealand where a US company is launching. One of my favorite new ones is in the Shetland Islands. Who thought that you'd have to schlep to Scotland and then get out to the Shetland Islands, but the Shetland Space Center is about to become very, very active. And when I give you some of these numbers, you'll understand why there is a need, why there is a demand for more spaceports, more access to space. Because by my count, we're roughly at around day 92 of 2021, which seems in some sense to be a little brother of 2020, but I think we're coming out of that. We've had about 26 launches, I think, to date. Some really fascinating numbers. We've mentioned Rocket Lab a couple times. Of course, many of you have seen SpaceX and the things they've been doing with a crewed launch and some of the experimentation that's going on down in Texas now. Something you might not know about is that on the 24th of January this year, a record was set. And that's the Indian Space Organization launched a rocket with 143 spacecraft aboard. So in one launch, we got 143 spacecraft. I'll talk to you in a few seconds as we transition to from launch, from spaceports, from launch vehicles. And I've only, again, just very, very gently scratched the surface of all the activity in that area. Moving to communications, the need to communicate with those assets on orbit, to have the assets on orbit communicate amongst themselves. Companies like Analytical Space talking about putting up a mesh network that will initially be radio frequency communications, but ultimately transitioning to laser communications among communication satellites in space. A company called Nebula Computing, which is going to put data centers in space, right? There is, with the advent of the Internet of Things and the demands for data centers on Earth, neither Amazon nor Microsoft nor Dell nor Google could build out data centers as fast as the cloud needs to expand. And further, they're massive hogs, right, of water for cooling, and they generate a tremendous amount of heat. Microsoft earlier this year experimented with putting a data center in the North Sea and taking advantage of the cold water. But yet, the good news was they got the cooling from the water. The bad news is, of course, that that heat was transferred into the ocean, and we have to pay that bill, if you will, at some point. But putting a data center on orbit, right, with solar panels, now I've got sort of all the energy I need provided by the sun, and I've got the cooling I need provided by being in space. So there are certainly some engineering challenges associated with managing the thermal dynamics of that, but the idea of putting a mesh architecture of communications in space, a data center in space, and as I talk into Earth observation, some of the things we think about, imaging satellites, you could begin, and analytics, you could begin to see where a satellite could take a picture and pass that along through this mesh network into a data center on orbit, where there would be analytical software, and all you'd have to bring down is an answer. You wouldn't even have to bring down the picture itself or the pixels. So I talked a little bit about space architecture. SpaceX to date has put up, I think as of the 11th of March, 1,200 Starlink satellites. Again, creating a cell network, if you will, in space. So allowing for people who are in areas who don't have access to cellular infrastructure to have communications and to have a backup communications architecture. There's a number of things, but Starlink putting up this very robust set of satellites, again, 1,200 to date. And then there's the companies that I mentioned earlier. So when you think about Amazon and Microsoft and Google, are all now in the space ground station business, because they recognize that they want to be able to provide that as a service. They want to be the ones that store the data that come down from various satellites. They want to be the ones that are communicating up. They want to put themselves in the middle of this burgeoning space economy, and they want to be right there at the center of it. So if you want to build a satellite now, or if you just have a sensor, you can go to a company that does space as a service. You can append your sensor to their satellite. They'll fly it for you. Amazon will manage all the data in between, and all you have to do is give somebody a login to get to the data that you've generated. So it's a really fascinating architecture that continues to build out, especially when you think about the power of bringing Amazon and Microsoft and others and Google and others into it. There's space hardware. There's those that build satellites, there's those that build sensors, there's those that build the communications pieces, the radio frequency communications devices, the laser communications devices that are soon to be more commonplace on orbit. So both communicating from spacecraft to spacecraft and communicating from ground to space and space to ground. I mean, it's just a massive, interesting challenge. And something associated with that we won't talk about tonight is just managing the frequency spectrum around all this stuff, and more demand for a limited amount of frequency spectrum. Look at a company called Axiom doing a commercial space station. Kevin touched on this a little bit, but we're going to see people putting sort of hotels and space stations for civilians to be able to buy their way to go up and hang out for a while. And Axiom is well on its way. I just saw a video last night posted online of them building their windows. They're going to create a 365 degree sort of cupola area in their commercial space stations, so that those who go up will have this magnificent view of Earth, kind of taking that little viewport that the astronauts have on the International Space Station and just blowing that up to have this 365-degree view. And the moon is very much in play. This is not science fiction. We're talking about mining on the moon for minerals. We're talking about then the need to map the moon. And if you're going to map the moon, you also need to put positioning, navigation, and timing satellites around the moon. We talk about positioning, navigation, and timing as GPS, right? The Global Positioning System, but that's just one of many PNT systems. The Russians have a PNT system, and the Europeans have a PNT system, and the Chinese have a PNT system. And there will be one around the moon for navigation on the moon. There will be communications devices between here and the moon, sort of cell towers, if you will, so that people can carry smaller communications packages, because the moon isn't really close. We're going to begin to make it look easier and easier, but in fact, it's pretty far away. And so if you can lighten the load because you carry a smaller communications device, because you've got these relay satellites, then that allows you to do more things when you get there. Some fascinating other things going on in space hardware is the miniaturization of engines, the ability to station keep with satellites, the ability to move satellites quickly out of the way as space gets more crowded, to Kevin and Ryan's points. The ability to move your satellite in a very agile way and get that very expensive asset, because even just a small piece of space junk going 17,000 miles an hour in low Earth orbit can do quite a bit of damage. So talked a little bit about so we talked about launch and ground and comms and space hardware. And then I talked a little bit here about things that are near and dear to my heart that have to do with Earth observation, right? So I've worked in my career with the classified spy satellites, but also with a number of commercial satellites. And so there are a number of things that are done. So most of us think about electro-optical imaging. So that's red, green, blue. It's kind of seeing what the human eye can see. The imaging systems that are in your mobile phones owe their heritage actually back to the development of the spy satellites. And very interestingly, if you'd like to read the tale sometime, it was actually Kodak that was instrumental in working with the US government, and then a classified way to develop first regular film cameras that were in space, and then a move to digital imaging. And in fact, in some ways, you could trace that Kodak was instrumental in putting itself out of business as a film entity, because they were at the leading edge of doing electronic imaging, and we're doing it in the classified sense. Anyway, it's an interesting story. Another thing that we're seeing right now is radio frequency, so signals intelligence collection from space from commercial providers. So that's looking at the AIS beacons that are coming off ships, and things like tanker trackers, companies that are being able to show you where a ship is doing the things it's supposed to do according to international treaties and maritime law, and broadcasting their location, and when they turn them off to do illegal activities like illegal fishing or illegal transit of embargoed goods and what have you. And of course, all of us have been sort of consumed a little bit by tracking one specific ship over the last week or 10 days, and all the second and third order effects therein, which will provide lots of fodder for, I'm sure, many papers and discussions. Radio occultation, which is understanding how the Earth's atmosphere changes a radio signal and what that says about understanding weather and weather phenomenon. Synthetic aperture radar, think about the radar gun that a state patrolman is using to measure your speed. That's an active sensor, sending out radar, having it come back, understanding, doing the backwards math there of the Doppler shift, and since the radar energy is traveling at a known rate, and how it bounces off your car. You do the math and you understand how fast your car is going. Well, that there are synthetic aperture radar satellites right now. US policy had sort of stymied the US from having commercial companies doing this, and had spurred on great global activity in this area. But now we're seeing US companies do that because of a shift. Getting at other parts of the spectrum, using light detection and ranging, so LiDAR also from space, using photons. And then all of that data that's brought in, somebody has to do something with it. You have to make sense of it. It has to be able to support a decision or support somebody taking action. And that's created this whole market around analytics and analytics companies. Any number of those in the US and abroad that have filled this void with companies that were very focused on building spacecraft that collected data, but really didn't focus on what they were going to do with all that data beyond selling somebody a picture. And now that void was filled, as happens in capitalism. Somebody saw the opportunity and has funded a number of companies to provide answers to people who I don't need a picture. I need to know what my competition is doing. I need to understand something about activity somewhere, and I just need the answer. I don't want to have to figure out what satellite I need or what company I have to go to. Here's my question, please just provide me the answer. And so in the home stretch here, what I want to talk about is then thinking about, Kevin touched on some of this, sectors of the economy that are engaged in space. So it's the financial sector. As Kevin said, every transaction at an ATM, every financial transaction is governed through this positioning, navigation, and timing architecture. So if we were to lose GPS tomorrow, for instance, we might all still be able to find our way home. We'd figure it out. We have maps. We kind of been there, done that. But we couldn't replace the timing. And so you wouldn't be able to get gas, and you wouldn't be able to get money in the ATM, and you wouldn't be able to do a credit card transaction, because that's all governed by the timing aspect of GPS or PNT. The insurance and risk industry, trying to understand climate change and risk, and being able to see your house from space before a tornado hits, and then being able to see your house from space after the tornado hits, and being able to use artificial intelligence supported by machine learning to say what has changed, and based on their algorithms, how much do they owe you for your insurance claim, probably even before you get back into your neighborhood to see the damage to your home. Autonomous vehicles, all right, are rolling integrated sensors integrated with space and GPS, PNT, as we talked about. So smart buildings, smart infrastructure, smart cities are enabled by space and the Internet of Things being picked up and moved in large files through space. Precision agriculture. The worst thing a farmer can do is touch anything in a tractor, because it's being driven according to GPS coordinates, and it's being very precise in terms of where it's planting, and understanding and using spectral imaging to understand the health of crops, of timber, and precisely where to apply water and fertilizer and pesticides. And this is the same for livestock, tracking livestock from space, and understanding where they are, putting collars on them that suggest to you and share information on when they're fertile and when they're not, when you have to get them in for breeding from the back 100 acres. So I mean, it's just, again, these are all applications that are enabled by space. Mining, searching for rare earths, increasingly a national security issue. Oil and gas, and searching for fossil fuels. Environmental monitoring deforestation. Emergency management, emergency mitigation, monitoring the impacts of flooding and severe weather events. Hyperlocal weather intelligence and weather forecasting. And of course, things like consumer applications. We wouldn't have gotten through the last year without our ability to get things delivered to us. And that's all enabled by a number of space-based technologies for tagging and tracking and locating and making efficient, effective decisions about use of resources for manufacturing and for deliveries to consumers. So I tried to take you on a quick run here from the types of things that are going on in space, the types of activities from ground to space and everything in between, and then sort of a taste of the sectors of the economy where the space sector is critical, the space infrastructure is critical. And with that, I'm eager for all of us to be available for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masback, and thank you all for your insight. It's been a pleasure getting to know you all throughout this program. We'll now switch to a more conversational question and answer format. I'm Aidan Kennedy, a Fielding Fellow, and I'll be moderating this conversation with two other Fielding Fellows, Owen Keenan and John Keith. If the audience has any other questions, you can leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try our best to get to them. For the questions, I encourage all of the panelists to contribute to each of the questions, even if they are directed at a specific person. Mr. O'Connell, we'll start with you. Why are satellites a worthwhile investment from the perspective of your specific field? Why should a government or private entity invest in space?
Well, so I think the easiest answer is that they're creating value, unique value. Keith's just walked us through a litany of functions. They're really creating unique value here on Earth, in addition to things we can do to explore the heavens. I think the best example of this, Keith just hit on it, was what we saw during COVID. I think what we saw immediately was the unique impact that space had on our understanding of what was going on Earth. You saw the pollution maps, you saw the traffic maps that were uniquely collected from imaging satellites. You saw the delivery of precise location goods, through GPS. You saw, telemedicine emerge. You saw teleeducation emerge. Those were all based on past space investments. And so if you didn't understand the payoff, you do understand it now for that particular case. Now we're heading into a whole new world where the number of applications is diversifying very, very rapidly. So I think it's an investment well worth making, in a general sense, but also in specific areas as well.
Thank you. Ryan?
I don't think I have too much to add to what Kevin said. I think, both Kevin and Keith covered a really wide array of functions and applications that satellite and space-based technology give us every day, whether we're aware of it or not. So, I think those capabilities are only going to continue growing. And I think especially if you look at, more emerging spacefaring nations, a lot of those capabilities are able to help in a very real way. If you're in certain countries that can suffer from famine or have problems with agriculture, you can use Earth observation satellites to really try to understand those dynamics, maybe better understand crop yields, understand better weather patterns, things like that. So I think, sometimes you'll get criticisms that, space is, it's a luxury for wealthier nations. But I think it really does have a lot of tangible outcomes for everybody. And it's a very valuable technology that I think we don't want to try to live without.
Yeah, so I'll take a crack here. I think I'd almost turn it around, right? How could you not invest in space technologies? Ryan just made the point, Kevin made the point. I was pretty confident he was going to steal this angle from me, so I'm appreciative that he didn't. I draw your attention to a couple of ETFs that are based on space theses. One is the ticker symbol is UFO, and the other is ARKX, ARKX, which is a newer one. But I draw your attention to those because take a look at them, right? And take a look at them. I saw a great article yesterday about the announcement of ARKX, which is part of a innovative portfolio that's pretty exciting right now and getting a lot of attention on Wall Street. But I think the headline was something like everything is space now, and there was some confusion about why a company like Amazon was showing up in a space ETF. But now, because you've attended tonight, you now understand that. And it talks to might be a company like FedEx or UPS. How are they a space company? Well, those things aren't being delivered without space. So again, I think it's a fantastic question, sort of a softball, perhaps to the three of us, which is how could you not invest in these technologies if you're interested in being part of a rapidly changing international economy enabled by myriad space technologies?
Hello, my name is Owen Keenan, and I am also a Fielding Fellow. Thank you for speaking with us tonight. This question is for everybody, and you can jump in at your own preference to speak. What is a major development you are most excited to see in space commerce in the next 10 years?
Well, I'm gonna. I see. I buzzed in before Kevin, so but please, Kevin, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All right. So I mentioned it. I touched on it, and I may be stealing his thing right now. Like, I think it's the moon. The moon is far away. The moon is not, super accessible. But it's going to become so. And something that I think most people think of as science fiction, the idea of mining for minerals on the moon, the ideas of building bases on the moon. A recent announcement from the Chinese and the Russians that they plan to collaborate on the moon with respect to creating a base. And then all the things that have to go with that, the transit to the moon, the communications to and from the moon, the cargo that has to get delivered to the moon, right? The packages that have to get delivered when people celebrate birthdays on the moon. And then the mapping and the PNT or GPS around the moon that I mentioned. I mean, this is all happening. This is all coming a lot sooner than I think anyone fully appreciates, except people who spend a lot of time in this business. So again, if I had to choose one thing, I think that would be it.
Hey, Kevin,
Yes.
could you talk a little bit about also the medical technology that's going to be, the fact that you could grow a liver in space, all that's fascinating.
Yeah, let me. I actually didn't have the same answer that Keith had, so I'll go a different direction. I'm really excited about the whole satellite servicing industry because what we're seeing is really the changing of the economics of space. I mean, there are very few space economists around, but the economics of space is changing. In the old days, whenever that was, an entrepreneur could have a space idea, and to test the idea, good or bad, their biggest logjam was launch. Okay. And we talked today about roughly 120 companies around the world that say they're in the launch business. Some are and some probably aren't. But, there's so much launch capability coming. We're almost on the verge of launch on demand, which means that entrepreneur doesn't need to wait 3 years to try his or her idea out. Okay. In addition to those economics that are coming from those kind of dynamics, we're starting to see the ability to inspect satellites in space, to repair them, to refuel them. This month alone, I think the launch is still on track. There's a guy going to launch a fuel tanker to be put in space so you can refuel your satellite with any one of a variety of fuels that's up there. And so I'm really excited about satellite servicing because it will, again, lower the costs of access to space and operating in space. And that's how you're going to get to the moon. And that's how you're going to do a lot of the things we've been talking about. Shirley, why don't I let Ryan answer the question, then I'll come back to your question about the liver in space.
I mean, I think all of you have great answers. And to kind of build off of Keith's point a bit, I think space resource utilization in general is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch. I mean, when you go to the moon, it's not going to be very economical to have to ship everything from Earth to the moon, whether it's fuel or other resources. So I think the development of that is going to be fascinating. I mean, asteroid mining sounds like a very interesting avenue to go down one day. And also to Kevin's point about, RPO, also, several companies are really trying to do 3D printing in space too, to kind of just send up the raw materials, print your satellite or, parts of your satellite in orbit and, take it from there, which I think is also a really fascinating way to go. Now I want to hear about these space livers. So, yeah.
Well, and so, it's a perfect segue from what we've been talking about. The microgravity environment of space allows us to do things in a different way than we do them here on Earth. And so we can create much purer pharmaceuticals. We can create much purer metals, very strong metals. And one of the things we can do is use the microgravity environment to grow human organs. Okay, that may make you nervous. You know, it may sound, you know, truly science fiction-y, but it can be done at a faster rate. There's certainly a lot of ethical issues and others that go along with it, but the capability to do that exists, you know, really as we speak. Folks are experimenting with this now. I also want to talk on the broader issue of space medicine. One of the things that we have to really care about is the effects of the harsh space environment on the human being. So there is a nice, robust group of folks working on the whole question of space medicine. It's one of the reasons why space nuclear power, introduced strongly during the last administration, reaffirmed almost immediately in this one, is really important because it helps humans move through space a lot faster, thereby mitigating those deleterious effects on their bodies, literally on their bodies. And so that whole field of space medicine is changing very rapidly as well.
All right, I'm going to butt in. Hello, everyone. I'm John Keefe. I'm a fielding fellow from New Jersey. I'd like to begin with a very general question, but first, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. So this question is posed to everyone on the panel, and this is, how has the space industry felt the impact of COVID-19?
So let me start on that quickly. Obviously, like any other industry, the space industry was hit very hard by COVID. But we actually found it to be quite resilient in a number of ways. Number one, it was able to benefit from all of the federal programs that were in place, PPP, CARES Act, all those kind of things. In my own personal experience being at Commerce at the time, there were a couple of things that actually lent it to really staying quite resilient. Number one, as I said earlier, a lot of the things that were going on in space were actually helping to mitigate the effects of COVID. Secondly, the space industry did a nice job of banding together. I remember a number of phone calls in which we had 25 industry associations from around the country talking to us about the unique impacts on their workforce, on their staff, on their production, things like that. And they got the benefit, in some cases, of what was called the essentiality determination, the Pentagon or NASA saying, okay, by exception, with careful precaution, you can actually keep working on your activities. And then in some cases, you know, we saw some of the younger companies fueled in the supply chain by the larger companies. And so overall, the industry came out quite well. You know, I talked briefly about the private sector finance in the space industry. 2020, shockingly, was the best year in history, you know, for that. And you would not, if we had sat here a year ago tonight, we would never have come to, you know, we would have said, oh my God, forget it. It's not going to happen. But it was still the strongest year on record. And it's just a sign to the previous question, how important space is in so many different ways.
Yeah, let me add to Kevin's answer. I exist in the space startup world. There was no plan, as has been the story of my career. I just ended up here somehow. And this past year has in fact been remarkable. And I think part of it actually accrues to how much business got done when travel was taken out of the equation. And so the number of Zooms and WebExes and Microsoft Teams engagements I had where I was advising companies or involved in due diligence calls with investors, you know, in the 2019 and the 2018 paradigm, those all would have involved flying somewhere. Those all would have involved needing to have that steely-eyed look into the eyes of a founder and really a VC, really putting that founder through their paces to vet them, to do diligence. And this past year, that just simply moved online. And that allowed think about a VC sitting in their conference room in Boston, being able to speak with a company in Austin and Atlanta and Chicago and Phoenix and Silicon Valley, you know, all within a few hours. And then being able to sit in that conference room together or virtually and make a decision about who they were going to fund. So the amount of activity, the statistic that Kevin alluded to in 2020 I don't think any of us could have anticipated that a year ago. But now looking back, it really seems completely intuitive.
Yeah.
I took my first business trip this week since the middle of February of last year. And it was just sort of surreal. I got back this morning, and while I think there was some importance and some value to being face to face on it, it absolutely could have been accomplished, over Zoom or some other way.
I'll just, for the sake of chiming in, defer to Kevin and Keith on this. This is far more their area than mine, but just a general comment and building off of what Keith said is that, I feel like COVID kind of made people both feel farther apart and much closer together than ever before, in the sense that, when the pandemic first happened, I thought that my workload would decrease. I thought there would be fewer meetings, people would be preoccupied with other things. But I found myself that very much the opposite. Now, situations where I probably wouldn't, attend this, I can, because it's much easier than flying somewhere. So I found that there were a lot more connections, a lot more discussions going on in these virtual formats than probably would have been in person.
All right, thanks very much. I'm going to dip into the Q&A, and I'm just going to start in the way they were submitted. So I'm going to start with Sarah Kenny's question, and that's, given the increased access to and release of small satellites and the broader participation of nation states and commercial companies in space, where do you foresee the regulation of space orbits and waste management moving in the future? Are discussions happening in the government and commercial sector on these issues? I believe that's up for everyone.
Ryan, you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I will say that these conversations are definitely happening in the government. These are really important questions that aren't going away anytime soon. And specifically with the issue of debris, it's just a really tricky one, because when you launch, you're going to create debris to some degree. You can mitigate that, but there's probably going to be some debris. You have a lot of things up there already that are dead or inactive. So you either have to wait for them to deorbit eventually, which can take a very long time, or you could try to actively remove them. And then, kind of touching on the point of registration, like we talked about before, all those objects are owned by somebody, technically. Whoever launched them or whoever is the launching state owns that object. And if you want to go take it down, you have to talk to them about it. So, say you have a French company who is really into active debris removal, and, maybe there's some broken Russian rocket stage up there, they would have to talk to Russia about that. And, sometimes you have these political dynamics that may make that difficult too. So there's a lot to consider for that, but if it's an issue we don't address, it's not going to get any better.
Yeah, I'll just say that, in the toolkit, it's an extremely complex issue. And frankly, as a matter of international partnership, it's a tremendous issue around which to forge partnerships, because there's so much to do. And you don't even need to have a space capability to do it. You can have an analytics capability or a visualization capability, something we talked to with our civil and commercial allies, over the last few years. But in the space debris toolkit, you got 4 things that you can do. The first is, don't create new debris when you go up. That's probably the easiest, just by how you design your satellites, et cetera. Second, the thing that we spent a lot of time on in our time of commerce, improving space situational awareness. Again, how well do we understand the space environment, how different objects behave in space? If I see something that's tumbling, that behaves very different, of course, than something that is static but still moving. As I think Ryan said, it's 17,500 miles an hour. There's something called space traffic management, which was a more controversial term because it implied, many times people would say, hey, Kevin, do you want to be the traffic cop for space? I didn't. But the idea was that by improving the knowledge of what the space environment was like and how things were moving, you could have parties cooperate, coordinate, communicate with one another in order to maintain safety. And then lastly, the point Ryan just made, active debris removal says I'm going to go pick up junk and either bring it to an orbit where it will be harmless, or it can be moved to an orbit closer to where it will decay and burn up coming into the atmosphere. Many tools in the toolkit. Not a lot of consensus around which one is the best or which one to use. Frankly, we need to use all of them. The one thing we absolutely know is if we don't deal with this problem, we're going to, at least, I'll go back to my narrative, we're going to raise the costs. The things that I said were the benefits, we're going to see costs go up. as people have to put more protection on satellites, add fuel to maneuver, things like that, or create a cataclysmic problem, which is really, going to be very harmful to all parties in space, including potentially the astronauts on the ISS and future astronauts in commercial activities.
Yeah, so first of all, John, I'm reminded of a conversation. So I went to school with your dad. Is that the case?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it was the hair. That's what reminded me. Anyway, so thanks for making me feel super old. So I guess what I wanted to say is I grew up in this business, in the spy satellite business, the classified spy satellite business. And it was absolutely critically important that we maintained enough fuel on those spacecraft that we would deorbit them at the time and place of our choosing to make sure that our adversaries didn't have access to anything that might make it back through the atmosphere. We were meticulous in our planning for that. We had fail safes, we had backups upon backups of how we were going to make those decisions. And as I transitioned and got more and more involved in commercial space, I no longer completely astounded by some of the irresponsible activities of people who are operating in space, but it is frightening. And I would say, having known Kevin probably for a couple decades at this point, he's one of the most relaxed, laid back people I've ever met to have the level of responsibility that he's had. But I have seen Kevin ashen-faced when asked about this problem. And I do know that in his former job, it literally kept him up at night.
That's correct.
It is hard to overstate the challenge of this problem. Ryan sort of in the trenches every day trying to create discussions around this, and that's nation to nation. And nations should be licensing and managing the commercial activities, that accrue to them. But the cost of being irresponsible in space and the first, second, and third order impacts, literally, that could occur in space and deny us the use of parts of space. It is absolutely sobering, and something that I think is really worth all of you considering, because it's not completely in the consciousness of even everyone that's involved in the space business.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
For the feedback. I'm going to hand it over to Aiden.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to do another Q&A question. This one's from John Kennedy. We'll start with Ryan, but you can all chime in. Does the International Space Object Registration Database also track national defense or top secret space objects in addition to commercial space objects? How does that work while respecting national security concerns?
I'm happy to answer this question. I also have a sneaking suspicion both Keith and Kevin could answer this question very well. So the short answer is that we do. We do register all U.S. satellites that are launched, whether it's from the DoD or anyone else. And that's true for the U.S. So we'll put that in a database. Understandably, there can be a lot of hesitancy sometimes about volunteering that information. But, it is one thing that's very true is if you launch a satellite, someone with a decent telescope and some patience can find where it is. So, even by listing this data in a public UN registration list, yes, it's out there. Yes, you're providing it, but other people could find it either way. So we do register that data. Sometimes it can take a little longer to get than others, but we do really try to make a very concerted effort to ensure that all US space objects are registered accordingly.
Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that I probably differ in my perspective from a lot of my brethren and sistren in the intelligence community, because I agree with Ryan. And Kevin talked about, Kevin has literally written the book on a global transparency, and that's really talking about looking down at the Earth. But I would say there is also a global transparency looking up into the heavens. The technology is available. The understanding is there. Yes, it is incumbent upon the United States intelligence community, national security community to endeavor to collect secrets secretly. from space and otherwise. But on the other hand, Ryan's articulation of the transparency and the ability of amateur trackers to characterize and understand and discern from the time of a launch, the location of a launch, and then figure out where the orbit might be, and then to work over weeks and months to track down those spacecraft. They figure a lot of these things out. As we would do with a human source or anything else, the national security community doesn't confirm or deny anything, and so leave it up to trackers, professional, amateurs, adversaries to try and figure out what we're doing. And it's a cat and mouse game. We want to be responsible actors in space, yet we simultaneously have this responsibility to collect secrets secretly, to do things in ways our adversaries don't understand and can't anticipate. And it really is truly a classic cat and mouse game, while understanding the responsibility to be a responsible space actor.
Yeah, so we wrote our book 22 years ago, which was about the transparency effects of new commercial imaging satellites looking down. And I'm sure that if you looked hard enough, you could probably find one copy for $1 on Amazon. It would probably cost you more to have it mailed to your house. But my joke has been that I could just take those remaining 6 copies and change the title to Space Situational Awareness at the Leading Edge of Global Transparency and make a few more bucks off it. We didn't make any money off the first one, by the way. But to Keith's point, there is a responsibility to be responsible in space, but there's also a responsibility to try to protect the national security. I'm reminded of a document in my early days at the RAND Corporation. It was a document written by one of the Corona pioneers, Corona being the first photo reconnaissance satellite. You could find this document online today. It's called Hiders and Finders. And so an early version of the cat and mouse discussion that Keith has just mentioned. And so if you're going to hide, you need to hide better in a world in which more and more people are doing things. It's a complex world, but it's one in which the benefits of understanding the space environment in a more open way, this was central to what Ryan called Space Policy Directive 3, understanding what's going on, the safety aspect, was essential to protecting the space environment, so all the good things that we've been talking about tonight can continue to be done. And by the way, that's not lost on the Department of Defense or the intelligence community either. Again, there's a common understanding that we have to head in this direction.
Great, thank you. So this question is for everybody, but we'll start with you, Mr. Masback. Trends are showing that private actors are taking over the satellite and space industry, with companies like SpaceX launching hundreds or thousands of satellites a year. Do you see the trends of private company involvement continuing? And how can governments work with these companies to help further their own interests?
Yeah, so taking over is interesting, and this question actually touches at the heart of a debate that's raging right now about the role of NASA, and that has been raging for some time. What are things that government should do? What are things that should accrue to commercial industry? And how might there be a very sober, clear-eyed discussion between the two of who should do what? I have my own opinions in terms of the Earth observation business. I think that the intelligence community should endeavor to build spacecraft for missions for which are niche, are very, very difficult, are for which there is no commercial business case. And outside of that, it's hard for me to fashion an argument why it shouldn't be done in the commercial arena. So this is about a change of culture, both on the open white space side and the black or classified space side. And as culture changes and as commercial access to technology and innovation changes this discussion, we really find, from my perspective, that it's policy that's lagging, and it's those types of things that are hindering the discussion. I think the facts very much speak for themselves. It's the interpretations based on where you sit is where you stand kind of thing. When people are in the government, they tend to protect their bureaucratic turf. And when they transition out of the government, you often see the very same people having a very different perspective on things. So it's a fantastic question that gets right at the heart of a critically important discussion, both in the United States and globally. So I don't believe for a second that I answered that question, but I'm confident that what I said is correct.
I think that the simple answer to your question is yes. Again, as I said earlier, 80% of the global market is commercial, and that number is growing very, very rapidly. As it turns out, governments are also spending more money. Ryan showed a chart or two on that same issue. Let me take it from a different perspective. Let's not knock governments out of the box on this, because governments still play an important role. And I actually, in my time at Commerce, I credited the government with being at least somewhat better in trying to help with that transition. Not perfect by any means, and we all have counterexamples, et cetera. In the old days, you used to see somebody coming into the market saying, gee, I can do this commercially. And you'd say, gee, that's interesting. We'll see in 10 years. Come talk to us in 10 years. The problem is today, given the spread of technology, the adjacent technologies in communication and ceramics, and again, all the things we talked about, it might be 2 years or it might be 2 months away. And I think the challenge in the government is, how do I anticipate what's coming in the market that's real? Now, again, all those oogie issues that Keith talked about are still in the middle. The culture, which is better, government or private, those things absolutely have to be reconciled, and they have to be reconciled efficiently. Again, I spent a lot of time trying to break regulatory log jams for companies that were stuck without any particular reason, or at least none that was communicated to them. But if the government does a better job at anticipating and even stimulating the market, the government, not just in the United States, but in Europe, we've seen the emergence of these incubators where the government plants little seeds, small pots of money. And what's different today is, if you get a couple of $1 million from the government, that company can then turn to the capital markets and say, gee, I got kind of an underwriter's lab, stamp from the government. We think we can take this commercial, and they'll get a read on that. And the read might be, you'll be a government contractor forever, or here's 10, 20, 30 million dollars, because we think you do have a prospect of becoming commercial. And again, Keith spends a lot of time in this world. In my newfound world post-government, I'm spending a lot of time in it as well. The key is the transition. How quickly can you be confident something's coming into the market, that the government doesn't have to do it unless it's a public good in a classic sense?
And I think the only thing I'll add to that too is just, the policy aspect of things and the regulatory aspect of things, it's a slow process. And, on the one hand, you don't want to be too prescriptive, you don't want to be too reactive. And before any of this is developed, you release the statement, industry can do this, but they can't do this, because then that can really hurt a lot of these developing industries and really kind of quelch something before it gets going. One thing that kind of comes to mind for me is another area of my portfolio is I work on planetary protection, which is preventing the forward contamination of other worlds from Earth microbes and preventing contamination of extraterrestrial things to Earth. So one thing about that is, back in, I believe it was December, we were in a working group, we released a national strategy on planetary protection. And one thing that's really coming up is, what do we do with industry about this? That's a very tricky question. You're now going to have commercial interplanetary or to other celestial body ventures where they go there. But right now, we don't really have a lot of hard and fast policies about what you can and can't do. And, under the Outer Space Treaty, again, companies are subject, or governments are subject to the behavior and national space activities of their nationals. So, it creates this interesting dynamic of where industry progresses so quickly and government, being a relatively slow beast, has a hard time keeping up. But at the same time, you don't want to be too reactive and overregulate and kind of shut things down. So it's this really interesting and delicate balance.
And I believe this will be our last question, and I'm going to turn to the Q&A for this. This question's from Harry, sorry. With international cyber attacks becoming more common in the news, are there concerns of the security of new satellites possibly containing sensitive information being attacked? And Keith, I would be particularly interested to hear you talk about snuggle satellites.
Yeah, so cyber attacks are a threat, whether you're underground, under the ocean, above ground, in the aerospace. People think of space war as something that occurs on orbit. But the easiest way to disrupt somebody doing something in space is to go get at a ground station, or go interrupt or get into a link between the ground and space, and vice versa. So in fact, I work with a company that is using blockchain technology to manage their offering, which is autonomous vehicles in space, right? So that if just like we believe that ultimately when we're able to achieve autonomous vehicles here on the ground, and vehicle-to-vehicle communication will make things safer, part of the mitigation plan for making space safer is to have autonomous management of the satellites, have understanding of where they're going to be, and make sure that they're avoiding each other. But a really critical part of the command and control of satellites is indeed securing the links. Snuggle sats, right? So proximity operations, the ability to take a satellite, and this is all technology that's developed and been available commercially now for a few years, to have the fine control to rendezvous, have one satellite get close to another and be able to physically damage it, to be able to do something else, to be able to get in the way of its communications, to do something in the communication stream, is absolutely something that's happening right now. But these are the same technologies, right, that allow for refueling, that allow for commercial space stations to have spacecraft, crewed spacecraft, tourist spacecraft that are able to get up from a launch and arrive and dock with commercial space outposts. So, we watch this and we take it for granted when we're watching these things that are again moving in low Earth orbit at 17 to 18,000 miles an hour, and bring them up from the ground and put them together like this is just something we can casually do. But it's really a series of miracles each time that happens, that allows us to do that, and allows space professionals to make it sort of look so easy.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on this in the last administration, something known affectionately as Space Policy Directive 5. This is another place, though, when we've talked about government or private sector, what we really tried to do was to encourage the private sector to do more information sharing amongst itself and with the government, because they're the ones that are feeling the attacks. Similarly, trying to get the government to share more information headed in the other direction, threat information, if you will. Very, very important topic. I couldn't imagine that the current administration wouldn't reaffirm all of those ideas and take them to the next step as well. This is key to our success in all the space endeavors.
All I'll say is I agree. That's all I have to add.
I'd quickly just add on the cyber thing. Kevin alluded to it. There are industry groupings that come together to share information. They do it in the financial sector, they do it in other sectors. So that relatively new is something called a Space ISAC, an information sharing council, so that when one space actor experiences something, they can share it with others by way of warning. So just Google Space ISAC for those of you who are interested in the intersection of cyber and space, and you'll be able to see some more information on that.
Well, I'm going to jump in here now and thank our panelists. There you go.
There you are.
There I am. This has just been an amazing, I can't believe it's been going on for an hour and a half. I feel like we just started. This has been fabulous. And I think everybody in the audience, and I know the Fielding Fellows and I all have so many more questions we'd like to hit you with, but I know we've taken up so much of your time. Thank you, all of you, for being such fabulous guests tonight. Ryan Guglietta, Keith Masback, Kevin O'Connell, thank you, and we hope we can keep in touch with you. You've been phenomenal. So good night to all of you, and thank everyone for participating tonight.
Good night, everyone.
Fielding Center to you, and from Gettysburg College, we say good night. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take
Bye-bye
care.
now.
Thank you.